Welcome everyone to MarshWatch number 2. This is going to be the bird ID session 1, and we're also going to do a little bit of intro to birding. If you want more about intro to birding, there's a video up on the MarshWatch webpage where you can go take a look at for more in-depth intro to birding type information. But without further ado, let's get this started. Just like to say that I am here in Saskatoon, and I'm located on Treaty 6 territory, which encompasses the traditional lands of the Cree, Dakota, Nakota, Saulteaux, and Stoney First Nations, as well as the homeland of the Métis people. My name is Leanne Latchmoy, and if you're brand new, and you might be because we had a few people register in the last couple of days, my name's Leanne, and I love wetlands. I started working for Birds Canada way back in 2008 for a graduate student, as you can see in this photo of a younger version of myself. I've always just kind of been at home in wetlands ever since that first field job. I do love them, and I have the pleasure and honor of working for a fabulous not-for-profit organization called Birds Canada. We have a mission to conserve birds and drive action to increase the understanding, appreciation, and conservation of birds in Canada. And hopefully we can get at some understanding and appreciation in this series here. So, what are we up to today? We'll do a quick recap of what MarshWatch is in case there's any new viewers, quick overview of bird ID basics, we'll cover some birds and amphibians, that part's going to be recorded, and then we'll have a quiz. That part won't be recorded, and then we'll get to the discussion and chit-chat as well. So, MarshWatch is an introductory program. We're going to be doing a lot of bird and amphibian ID by sight and sound. I'm also going to sprinkle in some wetland plants because those are important too. All of the webinars will be recorded and posted online within a day or two of being recorded. And we will have quizzes. As I mentioned, there's going to be some during the webinar, and there's also some that are living permanently up on the MarshWatch webpage, so you can check those out at any time. I'm also going to be leading some guided walks in select locations in Saskatchewan and Manitoba, for sure Saskatoon, Regina, and Brandon, probably Winnipeg as well. But I'm also open to requests. If you say, you have a natural history group and you say, we'd love to have you do a marsh walk in Swift Current, feel free to reach out and let me know. We can definitely work something out. And the ultimate goal is to hopefully give you some skills, and maybe you can submit a checklist of a wetland of your choice in June or July. Okay, there's also a cancellation plan because I get migraines and I don't get to pick when I get them. So if I do, find myself with a migraine and can't do that night's presentation, I will send a cancellation email out as soon as possible, and we'll just have a standing date. All of the webinars will be rescheduled automatically for the next Friday at the same time, and you should be able to get a reminder 1 hour before. I think I know how to set that up. Okay, so the basics of bird ID. There's kind of 5 things that really help you figure out what it is that you're looking at when you're looking at a new bird or any bird. That's shape, size, context, coloration, and of course, sound. Shape can be really, really useful, especially if you've ever gone out birding, really early in the morning when the light's dim and you can't really see a lot of colors, or, the sun is behind you and all of the birds are terribly backlit and you just get these silhouettes. You can gain an awful lot just by taking note of the different shapes and proportions on a bird that you're seeing. All of these birds in this silhouette, they all have really long bills, but they're all kind of different. The Wilson snipe on the left-hand side has very long but very, very straight as an arrow bill. In the center there, we've got an American avocet. It's got a very fine tapering little bill and it has a little bit of a curve to it. And on the right-hand side, we've got a great blue heron who has this great big wedge-shaped, all-purpose sturdy bill. So taking note of shape can be really, really useful in terms of figuring out what you're looking for and what to take note of. Bear in mind, though, that posture and feather position can really influence the way a bird looks, and if you've done any sort of bird photography, you know this. Birds do strange things, and I'm sure we've all had unflattering pictures taken of ourselves, mid-yawn or mid-blink. It's the same with birds, and, their different postures and positions can make them look very different. Take this great blue heron, for example. They've got that really big, long, snake-like neck, which they can retract and hunker down, and they are a completely different shaped bird depending on their posture. Suddenly, that neck almost seems to disappear into their body, and it doesn't have that kind of majestic, tall, long-necked look. In wintertime, birds use their feathers to their advantage. It's like having a down jacket that you can control. So a robin might most of the time have its feathers slicked down, but in cold weather, they definitely have the ability to puff themselves up, and that helps to trap air and therefore the heat that their bodies generate. And it just adds like a little layer of insulation. And that's how a lot of birds get through the winter. They've got those lovely down jackets. And of course, something like a blue jay that has a crest, a lot of those crests can be used to signal agitation or alertness. So they can put those crests up and they can lay them down. So here's crest up and blue jay with the crest down. So just to keep in mind, posture, feather position, they definitely impact how a bird looks. Moving on to size, this is probably familiar to a lot of you at this point if you've ever used the Merlin Bird ID app from Cornell. It's a really useful way to think about bird size because your field guide is often going to have a measurement for how big this bird is, whether it's weight, whether it's total length, but there's a lot of like small differences between those measurements sometimes. And if you're looking between two ducks, you're not going to notice, a 2 centimeter difference or a 5 centimeter difference on a bird. You really want to use these kind of bins. Is it roughly sparrow size, robin size, crow size, goose size, or somewhere in between those? So you want to pick those kind of benchmarks. And oftentimes comparing to something around the bird's habitat can be really helpful for getting a true sense of size. Context has a lot to do with figuring out what a bird is and what it might be doing. So ducks can be divided into two categories, and this is really based on their feeding habits and how they're structured and how that relates to their feeding habits. So one category we have the dabblers, and the other category we have the divers. The dabblers are surface feeding ducks. They can mostly just hang out and nibble away at the water surface, getting all kinds of insects and floating plant material. They'll also tip up, but they won't often dive underwater. They can do it a little bit, but that's not their primary mode of feeding. So if you've ever driven by a wetland and you've seen a whole bunch of duck bums up in the air, you can rest assured that those are dabbling ducks. So they're really good at walking on land. They have feet that are centrally located on their body, and so they do well in shallow wetlands. They will nest in the upland habitats. They'll take their kids for a walk after they hatch and take them down to a wetland. And they can fly from a standstill, which is important if you think about a bird being, nesting up in the highlands or in the upland habitat. They need to be able to get going from basically a dead stop. And dabblers can do this because they have bigger wings compared to their body size than say the divers do. So they have all that lift and all that power, so they can really fly up. And if you've ever walked through a field and maybe there's some ducks nesting or just loafing in some tall grass and you've had a duck explode up from your feet, that's a dabbler. Divers cannot do that. So divers, as the name suggests, they dive down and that's how they get their food. So they're going to be after things like fish, crustaceans, mollusks, the plant roots and tubers that a lot of the aquatic plants make. So basically their entire mode of feeding involves them going underwater, and they are built for that. They're pretty poor at walking on land because their legs are a lot farther behind them on their body. It makes it really great for swimming. They can really kick their little feet and get going really efficiently, but it makes them really, really awkward on land. And so these ducks, they will nest over water or near water. They don't like to go for very long walks because they're really bad at it. They're not designed for walking. And they also need a runway to get flying. They can't fly from a dead stop. So if you've ever seen ducks that need to kind of run, 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 and they flap their wings as they're doing it, and then they finally get airborne, those are divers. So there's little physiological differences. So if you're taking a look and you say, oh, there's a whole bunch of waterfowl, lots of ducks out on this pond, they're all really far away, you can watch and get an idea for which group of ducks that they belong to based on how they're feeding. If you're seeing a whole bunch of birds diving underwater, well, you can go to the diving duck section in your field guide. Versus if, well, everybody seems to be sitting up on the water, nobody seems to be diving, maybe it's a really shallow basin too, you can be pretty certain that those are all dabbling ducks. So that context, those behaviors can really help inform which species you might have, because ducks are conveniently classified into those two categories, the dabblers and the divers, and they're organized in field guides in the same way. Something else to take a look at, especially in coloration for ducks, is the wing pattern. Wing pattern can be really diagnostic. It's tough to tell for the most part when the bird is sitting on water, but as they're flying, they can often give you a really good look at their wing pattern. And the highlight here is the little speculum patch. So those are the secondary feathers on their wings, and they're often brightly colored in the dabbling ducks. Sometimes they're colored, more often it's black and white in the divers, but they can be really brightly iridescent and colorful in the dabbling ducks. So that speculum patch, those secondary feathers, those are important to pay attention to. And occasionally some species will show a nice little forewing patch. So in most of the dabbling species that we'll talk about, we're going to be referring to the speculum, and I'll be showing little pictures of what those look like because it's super helpful as birds are flying by, because sometimes all you get is that little flash of color. There's also a fair bit of seasonal variation in ducks. Most of the year they're in their breeding plumage, but in late summer and early fall they go through an eclipse plumage, and this is the birds molting their flight feathers. And ducks, geese, and swans, they all do this thing where they drop all of their flight feathers at the same time and they're temporarily flightless. And so the males will molt all of their body feathers at the same time, and they will go into this eclipse plumage that really closely resembles the female's plumage. It's not exact, but it's far closer to the female's plumage than their regular showy selves, and that's because they really want to stay hidden. They're flightless, they're hanging out usually in bachelor groups on a wetland, they're sitting ducks, as the saying would go. So they're pretty at risk, and so anything that they can do to reduce the amount of flash and color they're going to do. So they have evolved this drab eclipse plumage that really does resemble the female's plumage because, for the most part, she really doesn't want to attract attention to herself. You consider she's going to be spending a lot of time incubating and taking care of young. She doesn't want to be waving around a flag saying, "I'm brightly colored, come check me out." That's definitely the male's MO. So just to keep in mind, there's going to be a period of the summer where there's going to be a whole lot of brown ducks. And of course, they don't necessarily like, especially the body feathers, they don't do those all at once. So for a long period of time, you're going to see those male ducks just looking ratty. They just don't wind up looking terribly great, and they're molting in and out of those eclipse plumages. So something to keep in mind that adds a little bit of a curveball sometimes. And last but not least, of course, there is sound. And I get this question a fair bit. So, why do birds vocalize? Well, one of the primary reasons is to attract a mate. Now, this is primarily the males doing these elaborate singing vocalizations. The females are by no means mute, but similarly to, the ducks, they don't want to be waving around a flag saying, "Hey, nest of eggs over here." Female birds are generally a bit more subdued overall, especially in their singing. So they'll often do, just shorter calls. Some species have a female song type, but for the most part, it's much reduced. So when we're discussing birdsong, we're primarily discussing the males singing attractive songs. So they do it to attract mates, but they also do it to proclaim and defend territory. In nature, physical confrontations are really costly. Maybe not so much for birds, but either way, it takes out a lot of energy and there is some risk involved. So the more you can just say, "Hey, Bob, I'm over here," and he goes, "Okay, Steve, I'm still over here," everybody knows where everybody's territory is. And that way you can sort of come to a peaceful truce about where territory boundaries might be. So they sing for love, they sing for territory defense, but they also make noise to signal alarm. And if you've ever noticed this, you might have a nice wetland of birds singing away, and then suddenly you start to get close and it changes. The singing drops off a little bit and you hear shorter, higher pitched calls. Those are often alarm calls, and those can signal danger. And birds between species, they notice, like, "Oh, well, those guys are worried about something. Maybe I should be worried about something too if I haven't noticed it yet." So birds will also, make vocalizations to signal alarm. Bird songs are also, they're really great for ID. And if you start to learn those bird songs and calls and you get familiar with them, essentially the birds are telling you their name. So that can be really helpful because, unlike this handy little diagram, for the most part it looks like this. You're not necessarily seeing all of the species that you're hearing, and if you've had the pleasure of coming out with me on one of the marsh walks or, any other sort of birding walk, you'll start to realize that, oh boy, you really do hear a lot more birds than you see. And birdsong can really be one of those, magic door openers for, noticing the bird world around you, because oftentimes you can hear birds singing a lot farther away than you can see them. So that is a little bit about why birds sing and why it's useful. And I thought I would throw up a few resources for learning bird sounds. This has been great in the last 10, 15 years, with the explosion of various technology. You no longer have to get mailed a CD to start to learn some bird calls. There are all kinds of smartphone apps and web resources out there. Um, on the smartphone app front, there's Merlin. This functions as a guide as well as a sound and photo ID app. It's really useful. I know a lot of people are probably familiar with it. The one big caveat, and this goes for anything that's got those ID functions, it's suggesting a possible ID. It is by no means absolutely certain all of the time. So you really do have to, make sure that what Merlin is suggesting to you, that you're double checking, going, oh yeah, that does sound like a red-winged blackbird, because they do make mistakes. They are not perfect. So Merlin's a great one. BirdNet is similar. It's another Cornell collaboration. It's just more a sound ID function. I don't use BirdNet very much. Larkwire is one of those kind of niche things. If you want to pay for it, you can really start to get into quizzes and trying to, build your bird skills. And apparently, Blackbird is kind of a love it or hate it. So if you can try it out for free first before, jumping off the cliff and spending money on it, do that. But also, a lot of field guides that are on the phone now, they also include a bunch of bird songs. So Sibley Birds and Bird ID Pro are just two examples. They're paid field guides, but they also include bird sounds along with them. Sibley is the one that I use the most. I've bolded the ones that I kind of think are some of the better ones and the ones I've used the most for myself. There's also free web resources. I'm going to show a screenshot of the Peterson Field Guide to Bird Sounds a little bit later, but that is a great, great resource. It's companion to a book, but the companion is free. Cornell hosts it. Really, really useful for going through, checking out different species and looking at the spectrograms as well as listening to the sound. And the spectrogram is just a plot of what the bird sound is doing. There is an eBird photo and sound quiz. They do get you to try to rate the photos though after you do it, so they're definitely asking something there, but it can be really useful because you can set it to your location and your time of year. So if you want to start practicing for your location in June, you can go ahead and set it for that. Dendroica is another one that's free. It has a quiz function, and you can create custom lists and do custom quizzes if you create a free account. It's got photos as well as a wide array of bird sounds, as well as Xenocanto, which is wildlife sounds in general from across the world, especially those of birds. So feel free to check those out. There hasn't really ever been a better time to get into learning bird sounds with all of the resources that are there for you. And I would be remiss if I didn't just give a quick mention for just, the paper book field guides. If you're new to birding, I really, really recommend getting a physical paper guide, because the act of flipping through it as you're looking for the bird that you're trying to ID has a lot of benefit. You actually absorb a whole lot as you're flipping through those pages. You're just getting exposure to different bird shapes and groups and where they might be in your field guide. So I really recommend them. I keep looking over here because I really love my Sibley guide. I've been using it for years. I started off with a National Geographic guide. There's different kinds of field guides as well as reference materials. Field guides are things that you're going to take out with you, as you're out birding. Reference material are usually far larger or just more detailed and something that you're going to kind of read later at home on your coffee table. But there's painted guides, photographic guides. The photographic guides have come a long way in recent years. And there's also regional field guides. So if you don't want to carry the full Sibley or the full Peterson, there are regional guides to those. Just a note, if you are in Saskatchewan like I am, just make sure that whichever east or west version you're getting is the one that includes Saskatchewan. We're really smack in the middle of a lot of bird distributions, so some guides classify us as Western and some classify us as Eastern. Pretty sure we're Sibley East for those ones, which is counterintuitive, but we're really in the middle, and we get both Eastern and Western birds here. Okay, now onto the fun for this evening. We're going to cover 8 species. I'm gonna have to start talking quickly because I tend to get carried away a little bit. So without further ado, our first bird species is the Canada goose. I'm assuming that this is going to be one that is pretty familiar to everyone if you have ever been outside in the summertime. This is a large goose. Both sexes look the same. There is a bit of a size difference. The males are bigger and bulkier, but otherwise, visually, there's no difference in the plumage. They have this black head and neck. That white chin strap really stands out at a distance. Brown body and kind of a white rear end with a little black tail. You're going to find Canada geese all over the place. Wetlands, lakes, rivers, you'll find them in urban settings near water. If you live in Regina, you know all about this because there are a ton of Canada geese at Wascana Park. So really, they're found in any kind of open area with water and grazing opportunities. And they have a very characteristic honking sound. Here's the bird call. And it's a sound that really, really travels a long way. So you can be, a few miles away from the birds. And if you get this great big flock of geese going by, you can hear them coming a long ways off. Okay, and here's just an example of lots of geese. I can't wait to hear that sound because it's going to be meaning that spring is on the way. So maybe some of you are starting to hear this already. I know some of you are in the States and a little bit further south, so they're really one of the big harbingers of spring. As I mentioned earlier, they're a grazer, so they're going to be eating all kinds of things like grasses, sedges, other plants. In the fall and winter, they'll be eating berries and seeds, and they also definitely make use of agricultural grain. So any waste grain that was left on the field, you'll find them out there having a decent snack. Their little ones are pretty cute. They're precocial young. That means that, when they're born, they're basically born ready to get going. They're not like those passerines that are born as those little kind of helpless, featherless little meat sacks of a bird. Geese and ducks are they have precocial young, so they're younger. As soon as they're dry off, they're pretty much ready to go, and they'll take care of feeding themselves. They need help thermoregulating, but they can start going ahead and snacking on their own pretty quick. And of course, they are found in a wide swath of North America. Okay, our first duck. So the mallard is likely a very familiar duck. It is a large dabbling duck. The drakes, and I'll use this drakes and hens. So in waterfowl, you refer to the males for the most part as drakes and the females as hens. So I'll use male and drake interchangeably. And so the drakes have this really lovely iridescent green head. And the interesting thing about iridescence is that it really depends on the lighting and your position relative to the light source, the bird, and your eyeballs. So iridescence really it's a refractory color, and that's green wavelengths bouncing off of those feather structures and getting to your eye. So you can have a mallard that in the wrong lighting, the head is going to look pitch black. There's some aberrant color variation. Sometimes you'll get the odd one that really does have a bit bluer of a head, but oftentimes that blue head can also be, you know, the light waves that are coming through, at different times of day. Like there's the lighting can be different. If you're a photographer, you know about the golden hour, so lighting can really play a difference in how an iridescent color looks and if you're able to see that iridescent. So it is a green iridescent head, can look black, can sometimes look a little bit bluish. They do have a nice little neat white collar. And as I mentioned in the intro webinar, on especially ducks and waterfowl, you're often seeing them at a fair distance, and sometimes the lighting's not great. And white really stands out at a distance. Other colors, are absorbing some of the light wavelengths, whereas white reflects everything back. So it is going to look like the brightest color out there. Even if it's really dingy and dark, you can really see where the white is on a duck. So paying attention to where the white is can be really helpful, especially in poor lighting conditions. They've got a really nice, gorgeous yellow bill and this kind of brown chestnutty breast, gray flanks, and those curly tail feathers are really, they stand out as a kind of shape feature. You're not going to see these on other ducks, so those curls are quite lovely. The speculum is blue bordered with black and white in both sexes. So it's kind of, is again, it's a little bit of iridescent blue, kind of almost purpley in some lights, and bordered with white and black both above and below. And the males really, they just kind of do a quack, quack, quacking sound. Most female ducks have variations on quacks, and we're not really going to focus on female duck quacks in this webinar. That would just be a whole other level, and I'm not even proficient at all of my female duck quacks. It's a lot tougher to do. So we're going to be focusing on the drake quacks. So here we have the drake quacking. And if you have an iPhone, it is that exact, that it is this mallard call that is playing, and I have definitely been fooled by it when somebody's had that as their ringtone, and I immediately just look up to the sky because I assume there's a mallard flying over. Okay, now for the slightly trickier part, we're going to take a look at the hen. She's still a large dabbling duck, you know, she's going to have the similar shape to the drake, mottled brown overall, really has that kind of variegated brown with lighter brown and these buffy colors. And buff is kind of this pale beigeish color that birders like to use a lot because it tends to occur on birds a fair bit. They've got an orange bill with a dark center, and that dark center can either be speckles or it can be quite a dark full saddle. Like the bottom left here, this hen's got a really nice dark saddle, whereas a few of these other ones, it's more just a dark speckling. So orange bill with a kind of black overlay in the center of it. And they do have a nice fine little line that goes through the eye. Otherwise, fairly nondescript. The speculum, you can actually see this fairly regularly on birds that are on the water and loafing. So you can just see those blue iridescent feathers poking out with that white and black above and below. You can see them on a few of these resting birds as well. So always try to look for that little pop of color, especially on the hens, because otherwise, you know, they are brown. a lot of the dabbling ducks have this mottled plumage because they do nest over land and they want to blend into the dead vegetation that's surrounding them. So all of the dabbling ducks are really going to look similarly mottled, and then we'll cover little tricks and tips to ID them. Diet, these guys definitely are a surface feeder, and they're really an omnivorous generalist. They'll be eating anything from, larvae, snails, freshwater shrimp, seeds, aquatic vegetation. They'll get up, especially in the fall, into agricultural crops, any of that kind of waste grain on a field, so corn, peas, wheat, barley. They're really, a generalist. You'll find them pretty much anywhere that there's water. They're a true puddle duck. And the mallard is one of the two ancestors of pretty much all of the domesticated mallards or domesticated ducks. Most of them are derived from mallards. The other one is the Muscovy duck. And of course, mallards are seen again across a wide swath of North America. But that wasn't always the case. Pre kind of 1900s, they were fairly scarce in Ontario, Quebec, and very rare in the Maritimes. And it was only after, people started introducing them for hunting that they really got a better foothold into the east. Somewhat controversial because they do interbreed with black ducks back east, but just to give you a little bit of the historical context, they're now much more common back east, but back about 100 or so years ago, that wasn't the case. Okay, we have our second duck of the evening. This is the northern shoveler, and it is the other green-headed dabbling duck. It's a medium-sized dabbler. It's not going to be as big next to that mallard if you see them side by side. And one of the biggest clues here is that great big honkin' shovel-shaped bill. That's really where it gets its name, that northern shoveler. It's got a bill that looks like somebody stuck a shoehorn on the end of it. Really, really kind of flares out at the base and just looks outsized. It doesn't look, like it's got the right proportions to be on that bird. The drakes, they have this lovely iridescent green head. What really stands out is this rusty patch on the white flank. So especially as the bird's, maybe broadside to you, that white really stands out with that chestnut center. That's one of the best diagnostics for Northern Shoveler before I even see the bill, especially a long ways out. The bill's maybe not so obvious, but that white flank with that chestnut side, that's really, really, really going to stand out. So try to write that one to the hard drive, those white sidewalls and that, lovely little chestnut color in the center of it. The speculum is green, bordered with white on top, and there is a bit of a forewing patch in the drakes. It's quite nice and complete and bluish. You'll get a little bit of it in the hens, more just like a hint of a wash of blue over the brown. So quite a handsome duck. The hens, mercifully, they are very, very similar to the mallard hen, except she's got that great big shoehorn on her bill. So her bill is overall orange. It's got a bit more of an olive center overall. It's not quite, it's not shockingly orange or anything, but it doesn't also have like dark patches on it, just a bit more of an olive tinge on the upper side. Really, though, it does look outsized on their faces. And if you even see their young, their little ducklings, it looks like somebody stuck a slipper on the front end of their face. Really stands out. Just gonna take a sip of water because I'm running out of saliva. Okay, so otherwise the hen is mottled brown overall, and that speculum is going to be green with a little bit of a white border, and you can see it in this photo right here. It's got a little bit of that powdery blue. Oh, we did skip its call. Sorry, I'm going to go right back and we will do the call. Okay, I did skip the call. So, which is sad because Northern Shoveler is probably my second favorite duck call. And the males do this really distinctive suk 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 suk, and they do it a lot as they're flying around. And oftentimes I'll hear that before I even see the bird. So let's get that suk suk call played. So really, really, kind of characteristic suk 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 suk. I'll play it one more time. Imagine that bird flying overhead calling. Really, really diagnostic. Okay, sorry for skipping that, and thank you for mentioning it in the chat. Okay. Northern shovelers, similar to mallards, you're going to be finding these in any kind of wet habitat. You'll often see them in roadside ditches, small wetlands and ponds. They're a really common species out west. They're a surface feeder, and they do so a little bit differently than the mallards. They really strain out their food. They've got this filter feeding bill, and you can see in this photo here, all these little lamella, they act as they're not quite teeth. They're more like as a baleen whale has those baleen, I don't know what those are called, those structures that they use to filter out the krill. Sort of the same thing with the northern shoveler. It's going to take in a whole bunch of, water with plants and stuff mixed in, and then it's going to let the water out, and it's going to retain all of those little bits for eating. So they eat a lot of small swimming invertebrates, insects, larvae, daphnia, other crustaceans, and they'll also eat seeds and other plant remains. They're another widely spread species, except you don't get them quite so much in the east. You might have to come a little bit further west to see them, so you might see them on migration in the east, but maybe less so in the breeding season, but they're definitely super common on the prairies. Okay, let's compare those two ducks with green heads, shall we? So we've got a mallard and the northern shoveler. Their bill really stands out as being quite different than one another. The mallard's bill is yellow, stands out a fair bit, and the northern shoveler has a black bill. It's really, really big and broad, especially looking at those two side by side. The mallard has a bill that looks proportionate to the rest of its body. On the northern shoveler, it really looks out of place. It just kind of looks like somebody stuck, a shoehorn on the end of it. The body color for the mallard, gray with a chestnut breast. There isn't a ton of white that really stands out. There is a little bit of a white collar, but the northern shoveler, that bright white body with the rusty flank really, really stands out, especially at a distance. And we'll review those calls again. The mallard really has that traditional quack, quack, quack. And the northern shoveler goes suk suk, suk suk. I'm seeing a comment too. Yep, eye color is also different, but At a distance, that's really hard to tell. So it can be helpful if you're seeing them close up, but if you've got, a bird way out on a pond, the eye color is really, it doesn't always stand out quite so much. And our two hens, our mallard and our northern shoveler, they do really superficially look very similar. They're both overall that kind of brown and mottled color. But if you take a look at their bills, bill's always a good place to start when you're looking at hens. The mallard, she's got a proportionate bill, nice and slender, orange with a dark center, whether that's little spots or a big saddle patch. And the northern shoveler, it's big spatulate, it's orange, and it has a bit of an olivey tinge to the upper parts of it. If you do happen to see their speculum, that little wing patch sticking out, the mallard's going to have blue with a white border, and it's going to be green with a white top border in the northern shoveler. Okay, on to some passerines. Passerines are small perching singing birds. So we've got the red-winged blackbird. I love the way blackbirds are named. You couldn't think of a better name for a species like this. I love descriptive names. They're a medium-sized blackbird, and they've got, like all blackbirds, this kind of long, pointy, cone-shaped bill. It really tapers out to a nice kind of delicate point. And I'm pointing this out in part because it's really useful when you're trying to look at the female. You've got a brown stripy bird that has a long conical bill. It's going to be a red-winged blackbird. So take a look. Do note that shape. Blackbirds, they generally have a fine pointed conical shaped bill. The male overall is going to be jet black, and he's going to have these red and yellow shoulder patch. Now, as I mentioned before, birds can move their little feathers, and depending on how the bird is holding their feathers, sometimes only a very little portion of that red is showing. Sometimes you can't see any of the yellow at all. Maybe sometimes it's a little bit sun bleached and that yellow, kind of just fades and takes on more of a white tinge. But do know that it's still a red-winged blackbird, even if you're only seeing a little portion of it. As the angry bird in our title slide is showing, they really, when they're displaying, when they're singing, they puff up their wings, they kind of hold them forward, and they really kind of make a show of those bright red shoulder patches, and they'll fan their tail out. So they're a really ubiquitous species around wetlands and wet areas. The males do a really characteristic conqueree, and they also do really loud C calls. Let's listen to those. And those clucking sounds. Blackbirds are really, really chatty, and this evening's soundscape is really going to focus a fair bit on that. They do chat a whole lot. So I'll play that once more. Conqueree and those kind of loud C calls. Okay, on to the females. The females, they really, on the surface don't look a whole lot like the males. They overall are very brown and streaky. There's some patterning to the face, but the first thing you want to take a look at is the shape and structure of the bird, and you'll notice that really fine, pointy, cone-shaped bill. Sparrows are going to have much shorter conical bills than a blackbird will. So that is a clue that you're not looking at a sparrow, you're looking at a female red-winged blackbird, and they're really going to be intermixed with all of the red-winged blackbirds. So when you're out there, at a wetland, it's going to be fairly obvious that there's going to be a bunch of males and there's going to be a bunch of females there with them. So coarsely streaked overall, there is this nice pale eyebrow that stands out a fair bit, and they can have a faint kind of yellow-orange wash at the base of the bill, and some of the older females can even start to have some of those red shoulder patches like the males have. So you can see that just a little bit in this photo on the left-hand side here. And they're really ubiquitous in wet, kind of brushy, marshy habitats. I've seen them kind of on lake margins where they just have a tree to nest in. If they can, they'll be opting to nest in cattails above the water, but they'll also nest adjacent to a wetland if they don't really have a lot of emergent vegetation for them. And the females of this species are also quite vocal, and they do a lot of chucks and kind of harsh, rattly calls. And I'll play that here, in part because you do hear it a fair bit. So lots of chucks, lots of rattle calls. And they really they are quite vocal, and if you're at a wetland that has a bunch of red-winged blackbirds, it's really noisy. And you have to sort of take in all of those calls and clucks and chatters and just kind of, okay, I hear them, and now I'm going to try to focus beyond that noise. And we'll practice doing that a little bit later in the webinar. And here's an example, as I mentioned earlier, that Peterson Field Guide to Bird Sounds. Here's just some examples of how many different songs and different types and examples they have for red-winged blackbirds. So it's something I recommend checking out if you really think bird sounds are cool and you want to see, what those sounds look like. I highly recommend you taking a look and listening more in depth to get a better sense of all of the different calls. And of course, you can do this for any species. It's just really impressive to see how much chatter the red-winged blackbirds do. Again, very ubiquitous species across North America. And our other blackbird that inhabits the wetlands routinely. So we've got the yellow-headed blackbird, and again, expertly named, I love it, yellow-headed blackbird. That really describes the thing. Medium size, they're kind of similar overall in size to the red-winged blackbird, a little bit bigger, but generally quite similar. They do have that black cone-shaped bill. And the males are quite striking. If you've ever seen them in person, the photos don't really do them justice. They're really, they almost glow with the kind of yellow gold color of their head and breast. They're really quite gorgeous. They can take on a little bit of orangey tones too. Otherwise, their body is jet black, and they have this white little wing patch here that really stands out as they're flying, to and fro in the wetland. And they've got this tiny little black mask, and those features are carried over to the female, just kind of much more subdued. And they're kind of hilarious. They really like to throw their heads back dramatically and fluff their tails up and their wings out as they're singing. And their singing is quite well, it's a little bit unique, and maybe I'll just play it, but their their musical song is kind of goes beep boop wah wah, and then they have a snarl song, which is just an extended wah sound. So let's play that here for you. So it's kind of a hilarious sound. They really, they really give it their all in that long kind of extended wah noise. Play it once more just because it's so great. Okay. The females, as I mentioned, they're kind of similar to the males. They have a reduced amount of yellow on their head and neck. Their body, as opposed to being jet black, is kind of this overall brownish color. It's not streaky and mottled like it is in the red-winged blackbird. It's just kind of this plain brown overall uniform marking. They do have that little black mask as well. And again, that yellow is just slightly reduced from the males. These guys are super common, or not super common, they're common in deep water wetlands where if you do get them, they're often found in large groups. So they're semi-colonial. You won't often see just one or two on their own. When you see them, they definitely tend to hang out in a nice big colony. It's a loose colony, but they're a species that you won't ever find nesting off on their own, or if you do, very rarely. Much more of a western species, very common kind of in the central western part of the continent. They do just eke in onto some of the Great Lakes, a little bit in Ontario in a couple of spots, and around the other parts of the Great Lakes, but really they become much more common as you get to the prairie wetlands. Okay, we have a different species now. This is a Sora. This is a small rail, and rails are they're kind of like grouse in that they're very chicken-like. They walk around much more than they fly around, and their bodies are laterally compressed, so they look kind of thick, broad-sided, but if you were to see them head on, they're actually quite thin and slender, and that makes them really, adept at weaving in and out of all of those kind of dense cattail wetlands. Both sexes look the same, so the males and the females, you won't be able to tell them apart. They've got this nice bright yellow bill, a dark black mask, and they've got this little upturned tail which has a little bit of white on the back end of it. So if you see them from behind, a little bit more of a flash of white. They're mottled brown and kind of streaky above, and they have this blue-gray kind of cheek through the neck down into the body, where then it becomes a little bit more stripy. But the thing that really stands out on these guys is that bright yellow bill, because it's bright on a fairly dark face, so it does stand out a fair bit, and that little white tail patch, especially because they're running around in, wetlands and stuff, and in the depths of the cattails, there's not a lot of light that gets down there, so that bright yellow bill and those white tail feathers are going to really help to just catch your attention if you see them scooting around. But they're not often seen. They're far more likely to be heard, and they're very territorial about their singing. If you come out to the prairies and you drive up to a wetland on the side of the road, it's got a lot of cattails in it. That's where they like to hang out. Wetlands with a lot of emergent vegetation, cattails and bulrushes and things. If you slam your car door, chances are really good that there's going to be a Sora that responds, to that loud slam, and it's likely going to start doing a whinny call. So I'll play the whinny call. It's really, really distinctive. So it's really, really quite loud, and it really does kind of start off excitedly and then trails off. That trail can be short, can be long, kind of depends on what the bird feels like doing. And their other call is a per-weep call. It's much shorter, but it goes up in pitch and you can hear it a good distance as well. So here's the per-weep. I'll do the whinny once more. And the per-weep. And as someone who has done a lot of wetland surveys and spent a lot of time in wetlands, you hear them far, far, far more often than you will ever see them. I can't even, if there's maybe like 200 hearing Sora to one sighting of a Sora, that might even be too generous. So you can see them, it's just not very easy. They're a picker in terms of diet. They will walk around and eat aquatic plant seeds, duckweed, pondweeds. They'll snatch up invertebrates, insect larvae and adults, and snails. They also lay a whole mess of eggs, and I'm fairly confident that they will lay eggs in the nests of other Soras. There's a lot of waterfowl do this. Well, it's called egg dumping, where they just don't put your eggs all in one basket. Well, they take that kind of literally. I've come across Sora nests that have quite a lot of eggs, and a few of them, like this one here and that one in back, they're just differently colored. And usually, a bird is just going to lay similarly colored eggs. So oftentimes, if you're seeing one that looks totally different in terms of base color, like this little egg here, that's a good chance that it was laid by another bird. Oh, that is the Sora, and it's another one with a fairly wide distribution. I've done a lot of surveys in southern Ontario for marsh birds, and Sora are far more common out west than I ever found them to be in the east, but they do occur there. Phew, okay, on to our frogs. So got two frogs today. We've got first the Boreal chorus frog. This is a small little frog. They're not big, kind of 2 to 3 centimeters. They're hard to spot in part because they are so tiny. And as you're going to see with most frogs, a lot of them are quite variable in terms of their coloration and markings, especially the background color. And as you're seeing here in all of these different photos, these are all Boreal chorus frogs, and they all look a fair bit different in terms of, oh, this looks greenish, this looks brownish, this looks tan colored. The thing to pay attention to when you're trying to ID them, though, is this stripe that goes from the snout through the eye. It trails down the side of the body. So you can see it in this one. It's fairly distinct over here in this nice greenish individual, but you can even see it on this very dark brown one here in this pond. And There is a Western chorus frog that you will hear in Ontario, Quebec, and it sounds nearly identical, and I don't have a good way of telling them apart. But if you happen to be in the western part of the continent, the Boreal chorus frog is the only chorus frog that we have out here. And the call sounds an awful lot like you were running your thumbnail over the teeth of a comb. Kind of just makes a reek call. So in that recording, there's a few calling. They're not totally overlapping, but they space themselves out so they're not, for the ladies listening, they kind of try to stand out as much as they can, so they try to call in the gaps if possible. I'll play that once more. And it really does sound like if you were running your thumbnail over the teeth of the comb. Okay, our second frog for the evening is the wood frog. This is a little bit bigger of a frog, kind of 2 to 7 centimeters, a little bit easier to spot because it's a lot less tiny. It's another one that's going to have a fair bit of variation in the background coloration, and even some of them have a central stripe down the body, but not all of them show that. The thing that they will all show, though, is this dark patch behind the eye. So that line starts at the snout, goes through the eye, but it ends in this kind of really defined dark brownish chestnutty colored wedge right behind the eye. They'll have speckles on their body. Some of the individuals will show kind of tiger stripes on their back legs. What we're really looking out for here is this kind of line from the snout through the eye that kind of ends in this great big wedge right behind. And this is one that often gets mistaken by people as a duck or something because it sounds like it's making a series of harsh quacks. It's kind of a waka 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 sound, and you'd be surprised, but this is indeed a frog and not a duck. So let's hear the harsh quacking sounds. So really characteristic. They do that kind of waka 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 call, and frogs really they get going just as soon as the meltwater is starting to go. So, depending on where you are and where spring is at for you, you might start hearing these frogs fairly soon because they do get going as soon as they can thaw out. Okay, so those are our species for today. Let's just give a quick review of those bird songs. We got the honking of the Canada goose. The quack quack of the mallard. And the suk suk of the northern shoveler. We also have the red-winged blackbird. The males do a lot of conquerying and sea calls. And the yellow-headed blackbird with its very dramatic, very loud songs. Sora's got the nice whinny call. And they also do the perweep. And go over the frogs once more. Royal chorus frogs, teeny tiny little guys. And wood frog, slightly larger, wedge behind the eye, harsh quacking. Okay, now for this evening's soundscape video, I've finally figured out how to use Adobe Premiere properly, and I can export things now. So I'm going to be putting this one up online as well as the one from last week soon. That is my alarm going off for 8 o'clock. Okay, so this is going to be a soundscape where there is a whole lot of things going on, especially lots of red-winged blackbirds. And the goal here is to try to, take in the red-winged blackbirds and try to hear past them, try to identify some other species. There's going to be Sora calling a couple of times. There's going to be some northern shoveler calls, and then there's going to be a couple of calls of a yellow-headed blackbird, and those ones are annotated. So I'll preview the whole thing for you. It's only about a minute and a half long. Oh, why did you stop? Keep going. Okay, so that's a little preview. I don't think that the sound has come through super great. I know it didn't come out on my end. So I'm going to be putting these all on a YouTube playlist for annotated soundscapes, so you can listen to them later. And I do recommend, if you have any over-the-ear headphones, that you listen to them with those on, because you will be able to hear a whole lot more. So that didn't come out quite as loudly as I would like. For whatever reason, it doesn't through Zoom so great, but we'll learn. We'll do better next time. And that's the presentation for this evening. My contact info is here, llatchmoy@birdscanada.org. The MarshWatch webpage has all kinds of recordings from this year, last year. There's all kinds of quizzes that you can take. Stay tuned after the recording is shut off, and we'll do a quick quiz through the polling feature. You can reach out to Birds Canada. We are on all kinds of social. I did find out that we have a Blue Sky account because we were asked about that last week, but I don't think we have any posts yet. Luckily for everyone, the social media is not my department. So stay tuned. I'm sure there'll be something on Blue Sky from Birds Canada at some point here, but you can reach out to us in all these places. We are a not-for-profit, so if you are able to give to a not-for-profit, I hope that you keep us in mind in your giving plans. And I would just like to give a big thank you to our supporters who make webinars like this possible. The MarshWatch supporters are the Manitoba Fish and Wildlife Enhancement Fund, the Government of Canada, Saskatchewan Ministry of Environment's Fish and Wildlife Development Fund, Sask Power, and Wildlife Habitat Canada. So thanks to them, and thanks to you guys for tuning in. This is always a ton of fun.